In this episode, I'm joined by Brad Warner, Zen teacher and best-selling author of Hardcore Zen and The Other Side of Nothing. Brad recounts his unusual childhood, his passion for punk rock ethics, and reveals what thwarted his teenage desire to become a born-again Christian. Brad describes his first encounter with Zen, shares the secret of his decades of daily practice, and explains why he is at odds with the culture and institutions of mainline American Zen. Brad also discusses his awakening experience, the significance of Dharma transmission, his new book on ethics, and what Dogen's mysterious metaphors have in common with the TV show Ancient Aliens. So without further ado, Brad Warner. Brad Warner, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Well, I'm so delighted to be speaking with you today, and having just finished reading your latest book, The Other Side of Nothing, The Zen Ethics of Time, Space and Being, which was recently published. So, well, first of all, congratulations on the latest book. What's this, 8 now? Number 8 or 9?
I think it's 10. Actually, I was trying to work that out the other day because New World Library has published almost all of my books, but a couple of them have come out from other people, and that's what makes me a little vague on the number. But I think it's 10. And you know what? I think you're right. Maybe it's 9, because I was thinking Tarantino decided to do 10 films, and maybe I should stop with the next book. Like he's going to stop with the 10th film.
Well, what would be your final book then?
Oh, I don't know. I have to think about that. I actually have this thing where I write every book as if it's going to be the last book I'll ever write. It's just always in the back of my mind. I never put it in the book, but I'm like, if you get everything out, that's my policy.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. I'd love to ask you a lot of questions actually from what you've written there. And I noticed you're wearing a T-shirt with one of the key references in the book. Perhaps you could explain that.
Yeah, that's, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. And I think his name is Giorgio. I know it's Giorgio, but I don't know how you pronounce the last name. Skalos, I think, Greek guy. And he's on this TV show called Ancient Aliens, which is one of my favorite TV shows. I watch it semi-ironically, but it's always about how aliens were on Earth and they built the pyramids and whatnot. But it's been running for 15 years. But he never actually says on the show, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. But that's kind of a meme that's grown up around him, because he sort of almost always kind of says that on the show. And I noticed Dogen, who is the guy who founded the sect of Zen that I study in, he contradicts himself all the time, which is one of the most famous and kind of frustrating things about his writings, that it's got contradictions all over the place. So in this new book, I just kept, every time I would reference one of Dogen's contradictions, I'd think of, oh yeah, it's like he's saying it's not aliens, but it was aliens. So I just put that into the book. But I felt like I had to explain the reference for anybody who hasn't seen the show. So, Yeah,
that's great. Well, before we get to the book then, I'd like to ask you a bit about your life and biography.
Sure.
Perhaps starting with your childhood, you write in The Other Side of Zen, my family was not religious. I don't mean they were a bunch of raging atheists or anything. They just didn't care about religion one way or the other. And you also say you were vaguely Protestant.
Yeah.
And you go on to write, it struck me as odd that no one else I knew seemed to notice the awesome strangeness of simply being alive. They all appeared to take it for granted that this place, this planet Earth existed, and they just kind of went on from there. They were interested in football games or Dungeons and Dragons or parties or smoking weed or whatever else they were into, but they didn't seem interested in the incredible mystery of this life, this place, this state of being. So I'm wondering if you could say a little about your childhood and the context in which you grew up.
Yeah, well, I grew up, it's one of these things where to me it seems normal, and then when I talk about it to other people, they go, oh, that's really weird, because I was born in Hamilton, Ohio, which I feel like the names of the places where I was born and raised in Ohio just evoke what they are. It was a small town in Ohio, and then we moved to another small town called Wadsworth, Ohio, and that's where I grew up as a little kid. And then when I was, I always forget, it was 7 or 8 years old, we shipped off to Nairobi, Kenya, because my dad got a job. Well, he was working for Firestone Tire Company, and they decided to send him to Africa to work in their place in Africa. I think it was a fairly new operation at the time, and they were just getting people from, because the home office was Akron, Ohio, and they were getting people to bring it up to speed. So I grew up, like 4 years of my childhood, almost 4 years, were in Africa, and then we went back to Ohio. So there was this big shift in my life that, like I say, it sort of seems normal to me because that's all I know, but it I think really changed my whole outlook. And one of the things that I discovered in Africa, there's this huge Indian, well, you're British, so you know about this, but Americans don't realize that there's this big Indian population in East Africa. So I was aware of that culture and really fascinated by it, especially their religious iconography and their food, because we didn't have stuff like that in Wadsworth, Ohio, at least not in those days. And I was just amazed. Wow, this is great. When I came back, I was 11 years old. So there was this big gap, and it was all sort of removed, all that, exotic culture and stuff. And when I got to university, I decided I wanted to study something about it. And I was looking for something about Hinduism in the catalog that Kent State University in Ohio published. And I couldn't find anything about Hinduism, but there was a class on offer called Zen Buddhism. And the only thing I knew about Buddhism was, well, I knew enough that Buddha was an Indian guy, but I knew Zen Buddhism was the Japanese version of this Indian religion. And that's probably everything I knew about Zen Buddhism when I signed up for this class. So it wasn't like a lot of people come to things like Zen because they've read this or that, and they're really interested in their, like, I want to study Zen. But I just knew it was the closest thing I could find to what I really wanted to study. And I was just amazed. The teacher was this guy named Tim McCarthy, and he had been a student of a teacher named Kobun Chino Otogawa Roshi, who's since passed on, but he was a Japanese teacher, and Tim had been his student. And I just liked him, and I liked the philosophy. I'd been really heavily into the punk rock scene, which in Akron, Ohio, the punk rock scene was heavily influenced by what was going on in Washington, D.C., which was the straight edge movement, which was a very ethically based sort of punk rock. They were into not drinking, not smoking, they had a lot of ideas about just ethics, sexual ethics and all this other stuff. And so I really thought that was a great thing. And when I discovered Zen, to me, it seemed like, oh, this is what we've been doing in the punk rock scene, only they've taken it all the way. They've gone to the logical conclusion of this ethical and moral thing. And also they had that mystical side with the meditation practice. So I just started practicing Zazen. About 10 years after all this started, I got the opportunity to go to Japan and teach English. And I had some interest in Japanese culture, mainly from Japanese monster movies that I'd watched as a kid, Godzilla and all those things. And so I moved to Japan, taught English for a year, and then I got a job with one of those companies that make the Japanese monster movies, and worked there for another 10 years in Japan. And then they sent me to Los Angeles, and I worked for them in Los Angeles for 5 years. And then the company had a lot of problems, and I ended up being one of the, actually they wanted me to continue, but I didn't really want to continue under the new management. So I left that company, and now I do this. But I'd already started writing books. My first book, Hardcore Zen, and first and second, maybe even my third book, all came out while I was still working for that company. But I no longer work for them, and now they're having great success. So I kind of maybe shouldn't have quit.
I'm curious what it was that attracted you about the punk ethics, particularly.
Just, it's hard to say. I like I said in the piece that you wrote or you read, I didn't have a religious upbringing. So, but I was interested in people who had religions. I had some friends, the Tommy, he goes by Tom now. I always knew him as Tommy Kashingaki and the Kashingaki family. They were people who lived around the corner from us. Their father had come from Tanzania. Anyway, they were Catholic, and and I was like, oh, that's really interesting that you've got religion in your life. And I would try to figure out and ask a lot of questions about that. So I always had this idea of trying to live a good life, and I thought maybe religions had the key to that. And the punk rock scene seemed to be just into doing what, it was the early 80s. So the Cold War had gotten to such a point that I was convinced at the time that the world would no longer be here by the year 2022. I thought I thought Reagan and who was in there, was it Brezhnev at the time? Anyway, I thought they were going to blow us up. I was absolutely convinced of that. And I think a lot of my life decisions were based on the idea that, well, they're going to blow everything up before 1990 or whatever I thought at the time. And I wanted to find what was the right thing, maybe something that would deviate us from that path, or maybe just do the right thing while I've still got the chance to. That was important to me. I don't know. It's kind of funny when I think about it. Why would that be important to a 19-year-old? But it was.
Another interest of yours along those lines, you mentioned, actually hinted at it, was Christianity.
Yeah.
You write, when I tried to become a Christian, I found that I was required to believe a lot of stuff that I couldn't believe, which was an insurmountable barrier to my ever becoming a Christian. This was a huge disappointment because in my late teens, I really wanted to be a Christian. Could you say something about that? Seems an interesting desire. What was behind that?
Yeah, gosh, you're asking questions I haven't thought of that much. It's well, I mean, of course, it was the religion, I'm being an American and also being in Kenya. You may know this, but a lot of Americans assume Kenya is a big Muslim country, but it's not. It's absolutely a Christian country. So I grew up surrounded by it, and loved Jesus Christ Superstar when I was a kid, and then got into, well, what's this really about? What's the actual deal with Christianity? And I was attracted to it, and I thought, well, maybe these Christians have the answer or something. And I remember going to churches in Wadsworth and Akron, Ohio, when I was in my late teens, hoping that it would be inspirational and I would find the Lord and in my heart and all this stuff that they advertised. But as I said in the excerpt, they expected a lot of belief, and that was the big barrier. They wanted you to believe impossible things. I mean, it would get as radical as believing that dinosaurs never existed, and there were Adam and Eve on Noah's Ark or whatever. I don't know. All those kind of crazy things. To just even things like believing the story was literally true, the story of Christ and his resurrection and stuff. And I would go, well, why does it have to be literally true? It's still a good story, and we can still learn a lot without having to, no, you must believe that it's literally true. And I'm going, well, I don't know if it's literally true. I wasn't there. So that insistence on what I believed, I could never make sense out of that. And I still, it's something I talk about a lot because it's fascinating to me how belief works. Because in the Zen tradition, there's really no emphasis on belief. You can believe the story of Buddha and whoever else if you want, but there's no requirement to believe it. You just do the practice, whether you believe it or not. And that I found really, I thought, well, that's great. If I don't have to believe it, I can do it.
Do you think if there had been a kind of practice like Zazen that you could have engaged with directly in that Christian context, that might have hooked you despite the context of the requirement of belief? Or do you think it needed to both that action of Zazen in Zen as well as that you don't need to believe anything view?
Well, I like the practice. I like the fact that there is a meditation practice. There's something you can do, and that Dogen was really into this idea of you do this. This is my teacher in Japan used to say that it's a philosophy of action, and I took that to mean it's a philosophy that you do rather than a philosophy that you kind of keep in your head. Um, have there been I've read some of the Christian mystical literature since then, and thought it was really great. And there are certain Christian mystics who sound like Zen Buddhists. In fact, there was a Scottish guy, John Scotus Eriugena, I think is his name, and I was reading some of his stuff not too long ago, thinking, wow, this really sounds like Zen. And then I looked it up, and he predates a lot of the Zen movement. The Zen movement sort of started about, I think, about AD 1 CE 1000 or AD 1000, however you say it. And he was a little bit before that. Was he AD? No, Zen predates that. But anyway, sorry, my don't listen to me for historical. I actually majored in history in university, but I'm terrible with dates. Anyway, whatever. Eriugena definitely came before Dogen. I remember being struck by that. And he was saying stuff that sounded like what Dogen said in Japan, a few hundred years later, but putting it in a Christian context with God and Christ instead of Buddha and Buddha nature and all of these things. So yeah, I think that in a lot of these, the mystical branches of most religions are really similar, which I think is interesting. That the Sufism in Islam and Christian mysticism and some of the Hindu mystics in the Advaita tradition and the Zen Buddhists, they all kind of say really similar things. They're not exactly the same. The approaches are different, but there's a core there, and that actually makes me go, oh yeah, there must be something to this. These people sort of discovered this thing independently, and there's a certain kind of materialistic scientific bias against anything mystical as being, kind of woolly-headed and unsupported by any evidence. But I think there is a certain amount of actual evidence for the truth of the mystical experience, just in the fact that so many people in so many cultures that had no contact with each other until the modern era were running into the same sort of things and expressing it in often very similar ways. I don't know. I think I went really astray from the question there, but
no, that's very interesting, actually. Yeah. I've enjoyed many of your YouTube videos. Listeners and viewers will no doubt be aware of Brad's YouTube channel, Brad Warner. If you search that in YouTube, and of course I'll link that below. And one of the themes in your videos that you discuss on occasion is this idea of organizations. And you're not really a fan of religious organizations. And in fact, when your teacher Nishijima Roshi died, you were actually in charge. You were the head of the organization he left behind, and soon thereafter dissolved it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you have said along those lines is that Zen, to you, as you're saying, it's really around the practice, getting together to do Zazen. And of course, it's certainly in American Zen, it seems that there's a lot more to Zen than that. And often there are positions of belief, or mission statements, ethical statements, political positions, and so on, tenets of faith, actually. So I'm curious about that. What do you reflect often on Zen as it's popularly presented and experienced in Buddhism, and the kind of Zen that you're talking about?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think about it a lot. I kind of practice outside of any institution. My first teacher, Tim, was his Koban had kind of His brother was a big higher up, as still is, I think, in the Soto organization, which is the derived from Dogen's tradition in Japan, and he was like an important institutional guy. My first teacher's brother, so that's very confusing. But Koben himself didn't like the organization and kind of split from it, and then when I ran into Nishijima Roshi in Japan, it was the same thing. He was actually ordained by the head of the Soto Shu in Japan, and really had a very low opinion of the organization. And I think he was ostensibly part of it, but he never paid any attention to them. In fact, he would often kind of put them down as being kind of a guild of funeral directors, is what he would call them when he got on the subject. So yeah, I kind of always practice outside the institutions. Anyhow, let's see. We were talking about institutions. Institutions. What was the question? Maybe we should go back to the question, because I always feel like I wander so far away from these questions.
Well, I think what your reflections are very interesting. I was talking about asking you if you reflect on the difference between American Zen as it's popularly presented and experienced, then compared to the Zen that you're talking about. You were talking about.
That was kind of interesting to me, because when I first started getting into Zen, this was a period when, it's the early 80s, and especially people in the punk rock scene, we'd kind of gone, there's these 60s hippies and their Eastern religions, blah, that was the kind of general attitude towards it. And the culture overall had kind of moved away from that. In the late 60s and into the middle of the 70s, there was a huge interest in it. And by the early 80s, it was kind of gone. So I felt it was sort of a lonely position to be interested in this stuff. And then I moved to Japan, and pre-internet days, getting information about what was going on back home was a lot slower, but I would see things, people bring over a magazine or something, and I'd go, hey, this stuff is getting popular over there. Somebody'd send me a VHS tape with the Simpsons episode, and Lisa Simpson is talking about being a Buddhist. I'm going, what's going on? This stuff is getting popular in America. But when I came back after I lived in Japan for 11 years and started for the first time going, because I had a book out by then and people were inviting me. So I started going to places like the San Francisco Zen Center and some of these big Zen institutions that existed in America. Going, this is, I don't know if this is really what I was studying. It was, there were certainly, it was along the similar lines, but yeah, there was a lot of politics involved, and a lot of the things an institution has to do in order to keep its membership happy often seem to be more important to the institutions than the actual practice and what I thought was important to it. And of course, you had this whole culture of the Buddhist magazines and stuff, which I had, which have this big influence on, now they're online things too, and they had this big influence on what people thought Buddhism was, and I had not paid attention to any of that. And when I would look at it, I'd go, oh, is this what they think Buddhism is? And then of course the whole cultural thing. One of the books I wrote was called Zen Wrapped in Karma, Dipped in Chocolate, and that was, the title came from one of the times when I was back home visiting relatives in America. I turn on the TV and there's this commercial, I think it was for Yoplait yogurt, and one of the characters in the commercial is eating this yogurt and going, it's like Zen wrapped in karma, dipped in chocolate. And I'm like, oh, this is what they think Zen is. And so there's this whole thing that I feel in the new book, In the Other Side of Nothing. I realized that in writing it, I kept referring to the Buddhists as if those guys over there, the Buddhists, without including myself in it necessarily. And I was doing this without really consciously thinking about it, and actually ended up writing about that in the book as I'm doing it. Like, why am I calling them the Buddhists? And part of the reason is because I'm not sure I'm part of the Buddhists. I'm definitely an ordained Buddhist monk, whatever that means. But I don't know if I'm part of the Buddhists in inverted commas, as they say, with as they exist now, because it does seem to be a matter of faith and belief, and it's not that I was going to mention the politics. It's not as even as if I disagree with all their politics. Sometimes it's even, they even take positions that I'm like perfectly agreeable with, but I'm like, that's not the important thing. That's not what we're studying here. That's for the people who are into politics to work on. We're actually working on something a little different. I think something that's a lot deeper than politics. And why are you spending so much time working on that? I don't get it. That's not what this institution was supposedly founded to do. It's very easy to find people who are interested in political causes, but very hard to find people who are actually willing to sit down and meditate. And I think if as a Zen institution, what you should be doing is teaching people to meditate, and let them deal with their politics elsewhere, because the meditation itself is a very big commitment that I think it should be the overriding concern. Now I'm going to get in trouble, but it's okay.
Well, perhaps we could talk a bit about that then, meditation. There's something that's puzzled me a bit about your biography, which is that right away from your first exposure to Zazen, which, as you said, was through your first teacher, Tim McCarthy, at Kent State University, Ohio, you've practiced it more or less every day. You had a little bit of a stop and start, you said, in that first year. But pretty much since then, you've practiced it each day. Zazen, of course, being the Zen, one of the Zen forms of meditation. Maybe you'll mention what that is. But, a lot of people propelled into spiritual search through, or spiritual practice, if you want to put it that way, through all kinds of reasons, right? Some suffering, drug experiences is extremely common, a mental breakdown, this, that, and the other, some sort of profound experience of spirituality at a young age, or this sort of stuff, or an inspiring mentor, and so on. There's lots of things. I'm curious, why do you think? But one thing that I will say is that many people find this idea of regular daily practice extremely elusive. In fact, you've just mentioned that. Find it very difficult to do that, despite being passionately interested in the religion itself. So, what's going on there? Why did you? What was it about Zazen that captured you like that, and what was behind your regularly doing it for so many years, when so many other people struggle to do that?
Yeah, good question. Well, it's weird to me, because I was at Tassajara, which is a Zen monastery, a number of years ago, and I was working with this young woman who was we were doing some kind of project together, and she was 19 years old, and I started saying, what's a 19-year-old girl doing at a Zen meditation center? And then as the words are coming out of my mouth, I'm thinking, I was a 19-year-old who was interested in Zen meditation. But even having been that myself, I think, wow, that's really weird. So when I think about my 19-year-old self being committed to meditation practice, I'm going, well, that's strange. And well, there were a lot of things going on. I mean, there was that whole Cold War thing, and in my family, there's this terrible genetic condition. I think I put it in several of my books, and I guess I probably put it in this one, that I was aware of, that could that was another reason I didn't expect to I'm in my 50s now, and I didn't expect to get this old when I was in my 20s and teens. I expected to be gone by then, either through the genetic condition that runs in my family, or through the world getting blown up. So there was a kind of urgency to find out what this life was, and I remember the drug experiences you mentioned. A lot of people are propelled into that, and I had read that sort of literature. I had Be Here Now and some other books by John Lilly and stuff that I was reading around the same time as I was getting into Zen, and managed to score some LSD from the singer of Zero Defects. Had a friend who could get some, and that's a punk band I was in. And tried it and had some kind of eye-opening experiences, but I could also see that this is a dead end. You can't find it this way. This is, you can't. This will only take you so far in that quest. And I'd seen other people get burnt out trying to get there through using these substances. So I had that in my background probably before I sat Zazen, or around the same time as I started. It's hard to tell. It's hard for me to remember exactly the timeline, but I just thought, well, this makes sense. It made logical sense to me that if what I wanted to discover was the actual nature of this place I'm living in and this person I am, then sitting quietly by myself without distractions seemed like a good way to do that. It seemed like, well, how are you gonna discover it otherwise? You just have to immerse yourself in it as much as possible, and this made sense. And the thing about the Zazen practice, though, is I came into it expecting bells and whistles, and I expected something to happen. There's this cartoon that I've shared myself online. Gayan Wilson, who's an interesting cartoonist, came out with it, and it's a bunch of monks sitting around meditating, and the older one is saying to the younger one, "Nothing happens next. This is it." And that's exactly what Zazen is like. You're like waiting for the thing that happens next. Nothing happens next. But I was lucky enough to have a teacher who who was able to kind of navigate that, like, well, nothing happens. Well, where's the enlightenment? And Dogen's position was, this is the enlightenment. You're going, well, this is, how do I understand that? But the thing I noticed in the midst of, sorry, I'm picking up an Allen wrench. Anyway, the thing I noticed that was when I stopped. You mentioned I stopped and started, and I would do this Zazen practice, hoping for something to happen, even though my teacher said nothing will happen, and then get frustrated with it and go, well, okay, I'm done with that, and move on, do something else in my life. And every time I would do that, and it happened several times over the course of probably a few years, every time I would stop doing Zazen, I would notice the difference. But because I was dumb, it would take me a while to notice that the difference was I wasn't doing Zazen. So I'd just be like, the noise in my head would get louder, and I'd start getting more irritable and having various difficulties, and I'd be going, well, what am I drinking too much coffee? Am I not exercising enough, or whatever? I don't know. Just trying to come up with reasons, and then going, oh, I stopped doing Zazen every day. Well, I guess I better start doing it again if I want this to get a little better. I think somebody actually, was it 10% better? So somebody came out with a book I haven't read, but people keep telling me about it. Where this guy discovered meditation, and his assessment was it made things 10% better. But that was really important, and I can understand that. That's kind of the way I felt about it. It made things better. It didn't answer all the questions or give me tremendous experiences or anything that was at least initially resembled the LSD experiences, but it made life easier to deal with. And so I just kind of kept up on it, and I almost resigned myself to being like, well, I'm just going to have to keep doing this. It was no longer this attractive, exotic thing that I was, getting into. It was like, I always compare it to brushing my teeth. I realized it was like that. It was kind of that level. You don't think I'm preventing gum disease and, whatever, as you're brushing your teeth, or you don't expect, something to happen. You just do it. And you do it not only for yourself to feel better. I just brushed my teeth before we started this interview. You do it for yourself to feel better, but you also do it for other people, because it's I've talked to people who don't brush their teeth. It's not a pleasant thing to do sometimes, so you do it so you're not putting out this ugly smell to everybody. And it's similar way to Zazen. That was the way I practiced it. So I wasn't putting out all this terrible, bad vibes or whatever to people all the time. And it wasn't until later that anything sort of mystical or any of that sort of stuff that you read about in the Zen literature happened. I had to kind of do it as just a daily slog for years before anything like that ever became a factor in my practice. And I think that's the place where a lot of people just kind of leave off. I'm always reading books or seeing things where people are saying, yeah, I couldn't get anywhere in meditation. Like, well, that's kind of the point. You don't get anywhere. But if you can do it without insisting on getting anywhere, the irony is that's when you get somewhere, in quotes.
I'm wondering, you've been meditating now, you said you're in your 50s.
Yeah.
You've been meditating now 30 years, I suppose.
Or maybe more, yeah.
Yeah, by now. And so if you were to stop, how much are there any gains that would be locked in? And I know that by saying gains that are locked in, of course, I'm saying it wrong, but that's all right.
Yeah.
But you're talking about this sort of backsliding that can occur when you're not meditating. You think, at least in the early days when you were more on and off in the very first year or so, you say, oh, am I drinking coffee? I'm feeling strange. Oh, it's because I'm not doing my Zazen. What about now, after decades of practice? How much do you think would be, could you ride the momentum of that, or is there some deeper transformation that's occurred? And how much do you think the daily discipline of Zazen is contributing to your experience right now?
Well, I mean, I feel like the best metaphor to answer a question like that is like exercise. If you get into an exercise program and you really keep up with it, then you kind of keep up with the benefits of it. And if you stop doing it, you lose the benefits. You certainly keep something of it. You might keep a kind of a discipline or something like that, but you lose the benefits of the daily exercise because you're not exercising daily. That kind of happens. I suppose, there's certain things, there's certain experiences I've had in and around Zen that have turned my way of looking at the world upside down, as it were. And I guess the kids these days say unsee, it's like something you can't unsee, sorry, I like to sound like an old guy sometimes. Anyway, I've seen things that I can't unsee as part of my practice, and I can't go back to looking at the world the way I used to look at it. That certainly wouldn't be lost. But then the daily practice is a kind of, there's a factor of discipline in there. And I do notice that there are times when I just can't do it, because I travel a lot. I go to Europe every year, for example, and often that period of a few days when I'm, when I first get there and when I'm getting ready to leave, I'm not doing the Zazen, and I notice that it just shifts. And I suppose the shift is subtle, but things aren't right until I get back to doing it. I suppose there are people who just they have the experience that they've been looking for. This kind of a common story among meditators, and then they figure they're done with meditation. And those are the cases that always, whenever I see a case of somebody who's gone really wrong with their practice, it's often somebody who had an experience, some kind of a awakening moment or whatever they'll call it, and they imagine that everything's fixed now, and that they no longer have to do the practice that got them there. And then that's where it often goes bad. There's this kind of because one thing that's interesting about the ego, and I don't even like to use the word ego because it's so overused, but I'll use it anyway. The ego that you kind of are trying to work on with a meditation practice, it can latch on to anything to aggrandize itself, including the dissolution of the ego. Can become something that the ego puts in its little basket and goes, I've dissolved the ego, and it's really the ego talking about how it's dissolved itself. And you see that a lot. I see that a lot. And that's really a fascinating factor, kind of going, oh, you don't realize you're just doing that. You're just grabbing on to your spiritual experience as a way to, bloat yourself up and bloat your self-image up and seem special. And so many people do that. I think I've done that myself from time to time, but that's where it's good to have a teacher, because teachers are always, my teachers have always been great at cutting me down when I get into that area.
Can you recall an example of one of your teachers cutting you down in such a situation?
Well, yeah, there's something, I don't know if this is in Other Side of Nothing. I certainly put it in other books, but there was an experience where there was a time when I was living in Japan and getting really, even though I was still working at the Japanese monster company, my life was kind of really dedicated to meditation, even though I was kind of still in the working world. And at that point, I started to have some experiences, and one of them was pretty profound. It's sort of, I'll try to give you the short version. It happened while I was asleep, but it wasn't a dream. This is one of the weird things that sometimes happens in meditators. It was as if I'd become awake in the dream state, and then had, all this. It was more, I'd had lucid dreams before, but this went way beyond lucid dreams. And it was sort of, I could feel myself expanding into the entire universe. And it was this huge thing that happened. And I woke up in the morning for the first few moments, not even being able to get my orientation back as a human in a body. I'm like, where did this come from? And then, I kind of got it back. And I was very excited the next day about this, what had happened. So I was still working. I couldn't arrange to meet Nishijima Roshi and go talk to him personally, but he had email by then, and email was a relatively new thing. And Nishijima was pretty old, but he was kind of excited by his email, his ability to talk to people with email. So I wrote him this email explaining this whole profound situation. And he usually didn't answer my emails quickly, but this one he came back within like a few minutes of me hitting send on this one, where he said, you work in a company that makes cartoons, which I didn't. But he was confused about what the company I worked for made, but the stuff we made was very cartoonish, so he was right in that sense. You work for a company that makes cartoons, you need to be more realistic. And I'm just going, well, I've just explained to you the profound experience of merging with the universe. Isn't this what we're doing here in this Zen tradition? And you're calling it cartoonish and saying I need to be more realistic. Well, F you. And I got kind of angry at the time, but I had to kind of stop and take stock. And I'm going, well, if I just experienced oneness with the universe, the mind of God and all this crazy stuff, why would I care what this little old man in Japan thinks about it? and then going, well, I do care what this little old Japanese man thinks about it. He's 5 foot tall and bald, and and so if I care what he thinks about it, that's significant. And but it was really hard because I wanted affirmation. I just had this really profound experience, or at least in my and I still, when I think about it, I think, well, that was a pretty that's something that doesn't happen to everybody. But the Zen tradition sort of demands that you stick with whatever's happening now, and if you're not merging with the universe right now, then your memory of having merged with the universe, yesterday or 10 years ago or whenever it was, is no better than somebody else's memory of, winning the big game in high school, or, the things ordinary people just sort of brag about. It's just one of those things. It's not what's going on right here. And that's what our practice is about. It's about what's going on in this very moment. And so having a teacher really helped at that moment, because this is another thing I've seen people go wrong. They'll have these kind of experiences without a teacher, without somebody to kind of help them frame it, or sometimes even with a bad teacher who kind of helps them frame it in the wrong way. And then you can kind of go off the deep end with it. And I was lucky that I had an experience that could have sent me off the deep end, but I had a teacher who immediately kind of pulled me back from that precipice, even though at the time it was, I kind of say it now, and it just like, well, it had an email exchange with somebody. But at the moment it happened, it was like, shattering my whole world, because I thought, I had the experience. And here was my teacher saying, comparing it to cartoons. I'm going, what? So.
I once heard somebody say that one of a great Zen axiom is, when dealing with a Zen teacher, is whatever you've experienced, that's not it. Whatever you think, that's wrong. It doesn't matter what it is, even if it's right.
No, that's exactly it. I like the way you put it. Even if it's right, it's wrong.
But Nishijima Roshi didn't always respond in quite that way. When you had your taste of awakening, as you put it, on the bridge, soon afterwards, he actually wanted to give you Dharma transmission after you reported that to him. Can you say, I know you've told that story many times, can you say something about that experience on the bridge, and what do you think about that prompted him to invite you for Dharma transmission? And he made your Dharma heir, actually, and that's not an insignificant thing. That's quite significant.
Yeah, that was that and totally unexpected. Yeah, well, I mean, I can just tell you, because I worked at this company, the Japanese monster movie company, and they were kind of situated a little bit far from the nearest train station. So I'd always take this kind of 20-minute walk from the train station to work. And one of the things that I did every day was cross this little, it was a car bridge. It's something you might find them in the UK. You don't find them in America. These tiny bridges that are just, just go over a stream or something, and they can carry 2 cars. But I hardly ever noticed that bridge. And there was just this, I stepped onto the bridge and something happened. The whole world kind of changed. And by the time I was on the other side of the bridge, which is only, I don't know, 30 feet long or something, the experience was over. But it completely transformed the way I see life. I couldn't see things the way I had before. And the nature of the experience, I've tried in a few books to explain it, but it's really difficult to explain. But it was the experience of being everywhere all at once, and it was completely different from the experience that I just recounted before, in that there was nothing there was nothing extraordinary about it. It was the most extraordinary thing I could have possibly imagined. And yet my experience of it was like, oh, that's the way things are. And I know that that I continued my walk to work, sat down at my desk, and just started doing, answering the emails from the branch office in Los Angeles or something. That's what I normally did every morning. I don't think it was even emails at that time. It might have been faxes. But anyway, whatever it was, I just did the thing that I do every day, and it was fine. But everything had profoundly changed, and I don't remember. I don't remember any moment when I sat down with Nishijima Roshi and said, "This happened to me, and here's what it was." But the relationship we had changed, and the conversations we had changed, and there was something going on where we suddenly kind of meshed there. But I still didn't think of it as, because I'd read stories about people getting Dharma transmission and all this stuff, and I knew enough to know, okay, this is one of those experiences, but I never thought of myself as the kind of person who would. Dharma transmission is supposedly goes back to this moment, probably apocryphal, that happened in the Buddha's life, in which he recognized his student Mahakashapa as being his equal. And they did a little thing. And then when Buddha died, Mahakashapa was the head of the Buddhist order. Then Mahakashapa passed this thing on to I think Ananda. I don't know, but there's a whole story of who he passed it on to. And there's this whole idea of this something that gets transmitted from teacher to student, and has been going on since the Buddha's time. And that's what Dharma transmission is supposed to be. Your teacher supposedly has this understanding and confirms that the student has also this understanding. And then the student is expected to go and teach it. And I never thought of myself as somebody who would do that. So when he said he wanted to give me Dharma transmission, my first instinct was to try to find a way out of it. Like to go, thanks, but no thanks. I knew it was this honor, this thing that he was bestowing upon me, and that was important. But the only, what changed my mind about that was because I was living in Japan, and I went back to visit the US, and I happened to go see Tim. I made arrangements to go see Tim, because he wouldn't have been normally one of the people I went to see, because my family lived one place and Tim lived in another. But I made arrangements to go see him, and I told him the story and about how Nishijima Roshi had offered me Dharma transmission. And he said, there's a whole lot of, I'll try not to work blue on your channel.
Go for it.
Well, he said, he literally said asshole. He said, there's a whole lot of assholes out there with Dharma transmission, and you'd be better than those guys. And when he framed it like that, I thought, well, if all I have to do is be better than the assholes, then I can do it. If you frame it as you are now the heir of the Buddhist tradition, this passed down from Buddha to disciple for 2,500 years, then I'm going to have to refuse. But if you say, okay, you can be better than the assholes who've also done this ceremony, then I can do that. So I came back to Japan, and I said, okay, let's do this ceremony you want to do. But yeah, but the direct connection between that experience and the Dharma transmission, it was never like I said to Nishijima Roshi, this happened to me on a bridge, and he said, oh, my son, you have seen the light. I will now confer upon you this thing. It wasn't like that. But our relationship changed, and I later asked him, why did you give me Dharma transmission? Because I once I was expected to teach, I thought, well, I'm not him, I'm not doing it the way he did it. I'm not saying it the way he said it. And he said, I did it because you understand me completely. And when he said me, I think when he said me, he wasn't referring to, Kazuo Nishijima. That was his birth name, who'd grown up in Yokohama and, worked for a cosmetic company. He was talking about something something bigger in that me. You understand me. There's this sort of universal me that he thought I understood. I don't know if he was right, but he certainly seemed to think so. So I said, okay, I'll do this thing.
You bring up Tim McCarthy there, and if I recall correctly, he came through the San Francisco Zen Center, or his teacher did, or something like this. Am I right about that? Was Tim connected to that center?
Yeah, not directly, but Koben, his teacher, he was one of the guys that Shunryu Suzuki Roshi had started the San Francisco Zen Center, and he brought Koben over to help him train people, because Koben happened to be very good at training people for ceremonial stuff, even though Koben himself kind of rejected ceremonies. It's kind of this weird irony that he was really good at it. But he also was not a guy who really believed it was all that important. But he came over to do that, and I think Tim met Koben when Koben was still a part of the San Francisco Zen Center, but pretty shortly after that, Koben left it and started his own thing, and Tim followed with him. So Tim was at the San Francisco Zen Center a very short time.
I read that book, Shoes Outside the Door.
Oh yeah.
And about the San Francisco Zen Center and Richard Baker Roshi and so on. And that one of the interesting themes there is the Dharma transmission wars that sort of occurred. Who's got it? How do you get it? This sort of thing. What did Roshi mean and so on? How do you relate to Dharma? You're talking about how you related to it then. How do you relate to it now? Is it something that figures in your thinking much?
Well, yeah, I do think about it a lot, and I don't know what it means. I tend to downplay it a bit because I think it gets what's the opposite of downplay? Upplayed. It gets really played up. I guess that's a phrase in English, right? A lot. And with the San Francisco Zen Center, you had this figure of Suzuki Roshi, who was already famous by then, and so people kind of wanted his thing and wanted to be his heir. And so him giving it to Richard Baker was a big deal and very public, and made Richard Baker very powerful because there was this institution around it by then. There was the San Francisco Zen Center with the Tassajara Monastery in Green Gulch, and I think they had a restaurant then. I think they still have a restaurant. A lot of things in a bakery, and there was all this. There was money and power involved, and so Richard Baker didn't just inherit the Dharma; he inherited control. If he didn't actually get cash, but he inherited control over all that big institutional power, and there were a lot of people who were jealous of it. And even in an ordinary Zen transmission, there's going to be issues of jealousy and stuff, and that goes back a long time. There's a story of how Weike got his Dharma transmission and was supposed to keep it secret. He's one of the ancient masters, because his other students would be jealous of it, and so this happens a lot. And I don't know what to do about it. I've tried to stay away from the institutional side. You mentioned dissolving the Dogen Sangha International was the thing that Nishijima Roshi made me the head of, although it was much less than what the San Francisco Zen Center was. There was no property or anything else involved in inheriting that. It was just a name of this group. And I had so much trouble with it initially after Nishijima Roshi died that I just dissolved it. But then this time when The Other Side of Nothing came out and needed to have something on the back describing me, I said, well, just put head of Dogen Sangha International. So it's actually on the back of the book. So in a sense, I guess I've revived it, but I haven't done anything else with it other than putting it on the back of the book. So I guess it's back. I guess I've undissolved it, but there's still nobody in it. So it's a bit phony, but it was just something to put on the book to make it contrast from all the other bios that have been on the backs of other books. And but when it shouldn't be about institutional power and all of this stuff, but that often gets mixed up in it, and that's a struggle for me personally, because the three treasures are Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The Buddha is the Buddha, the Dharma is the teaching, and the Sangha is the group. And I always had trouble with the third one, the Sangha. I always felt like, well, I was always apart from them. Like when I wrote Hardcore Zen, I didn't expect Hardcore Zen to be a success. One of the reasons was because I had never, up until several months to a year after that book was published, I had never met even one person who was interested in both Zen or Buddhism of any kind and punk rock. And the book is all about punk rock and Buddhism. And I never, in all the sanghas I'd been part of, I'd never met a single person who shared my interest in that stuff. So now I have, now I realize there's a bunch of people who noticed that connection, and that's kind of interesting, because I thought I was the only one. But I always felt, that was one of many reasons I always felt like, I hang around with these guys who usually that's one of the unfortunate tendencies is Zen, is it tends to be male heavy, male dominated, although that's changing a little bit. But I hang around these guys, who like to meditate, but I'm not really one of these guys, And then when you put me in charge of those guys, when my teacher put me in charge of those guys, I'm like, I can't even relate to these people, I don't know what they're interested in. So I had to go do something else. But it is often taught as an institutional thing, and that breeds this kind of group think where everybody has to kind of, we have to put out our mission statement and our that's constantly a trouble for me when a group I'm part of is like, well, we've got to issue a statement about it. Why do we have to issue a statement? We don't want, as if we all think the same thing about, and we're going to take a position on, whatever happened in the world. And I'm like, why do we have to take a position about whatever happened in the world? Just let whatever happened in the world happen, and people think about it, whatever they think about it. We don't have to put out a statement. That's one of many things that these institutions do that I just can't wrap my head around. I'm like, because they're doing it all the time, and it's obviously incredibly important to them to put out their statement about whatever is going on. And I'm like, I don't want to make a statement. It happened, and I might have an opinion about it, but I don't want to issue a statement. So the things institutions do, just I don't understand, but I do think there's a value. This is one of the things I think is, it may not be Buddha's unique innovation. There may have been other people who did it, but one of the things that I think is very interesting about the Buddha is, if you go back to his life story, he had this profound spiritual awakening while sitting under a tree on a rock, and he had this moment of awakening that's very famous. And the first thing he did, reportedly, after this happened, is he thought to himself, well, nobody's going to understand this. I'll just kind of, it's nice that this happened to me, but nobody's going to get this, so I'm not even going to try. And the legend has it that the god Indra comes to him and begs him to teach the world. And I don't really think that's literally true, but at some point he had this inkling that, all right, even though I think this is impossible to teach, I'm gonna try. So he actually went out and tried to teach people this awakening he'd had, which I imagine other people that had similar awakenings and probably didn't try to teach anybody. They probably just said, yeah, nobody's going to get this. I'm not even gonna try, because it's just a waste of effort. But he tried, and I think and he dedicated his life to trying to teach it. And whether he was successful at it or not is one of these open questions among Buddhists that the Buddhists kind of like to debate, whether he actually did succeed in transmitting it. The Zen tradition, the traditional way of framing it is that he did successfully transmit it to Mahakashapa, but maybe the others didn't quite get it. But there's been this secret, almost semi-secret lineage of people who did get it, and that's what the Zen tradition supposedly is, and that's what Dharma transmission supposedly links you to. Although I kind of take all that with a grain of salt, but that's kind of the way they frame it. That whereas other Buddhist lineages think of it as he was successful and he was able to transmit it to many people, and we're among these many people who've gotten it. Whereas the Zen tradition has it that he wasn't successful at transmitting it to most of the people that he talked to, but there were a few who got it, and that's what we represent. It sounds terribly arrogant when you put it like that, but that's kind of the way. That's at least the story that we tell ourselves in the Zen tradition. Although, like I say, I don't know if I believe that story. I know the story.
That's very interesting indeed. Do you have any, among the people do you have any promising candidates for Dharma transmission?
Among the people I would give Dharma transmission to,
I know you have a funny relationship with this idea of having students, and so on. But you have the Angel City Zen Center, or is that still going? I'm not sure, but
well, that's still going. But I kind of walked away from it because I thought, oh, this seems to be going in a direction I don't want to go anymore. And so I was like, you guys just carry on. I'll be over here.
But I mean, whatever you call them, I don't know. Do you consider yourself to have students? The reason I know that you've made videos about that, you've talked about that idea. So if I hadn't seen those videos, I would ask you rather more naively, and maybe that's the quicker way of doing it. I'd say something like, among your students, do you have any promising candidates, or have you given Dharma transmission to anybody? Is it something you?
I haven't. I don't know. I don't know what would prompt me to do that. I have a sense of what prompted Nishijima Roshi to do that, because he was kind of known among people who know those things as being a guy who gave Dharma transmission easier than others, so that makes my transmission maybe less special, because there's like, I think 30 some people that he gave Dharma transmission to. I figured it out one time. I think it was over 20, but maybe it wasn't quite 30. But he'd given, and some people don't give Dharma transmission to anybody. There's a guy who just passed away, who was rather famous, and without making any Dharma heirs at all, and that caused a lot of problems for his the institution that he'd set up, because nobody's a clear head of it.
Are you talking about Sasaki Roshi?
Yeah, Sasaki Roshi. Yeah, didn't make any Dharma heirs. So and I'm living right now just a few minutes drive from his place at Mount Baldy, and somebody was there recently, said, oh, it's kind of falling apart because nobody's really because of that. That's part of the problem is he didn't make a clear heir, whereas Nishijima Roshi did, on a number of occasions make clear Dharma heirs. And I think about that in terms of myself. What would, to me, it would have to be, I guess this may be the way everybody does it, probably to a certain extent. It would have to be something that was similar to what happened to me, and I haven't found anybody who seems to have dug that deeply into it. There's a lot of people around, and it's kind of frustrating. There's a lot of people around who want it, who see it as a thing they want to get, and who will. I've had people do all sorts of weird, thinking they can flatter me into it, or even buy their way into it. There was a guy a few years ago who was literally trying to buy his way into a Dharma transmission from me, which I was just like, you're not going to get it that way. and he was apparently really rich. I probably could be rich right now. Sometimes I think about things like that and go, oh. Anyway, but yeah, this rich guy wanted to buy Dharma transmission from me, and there's a lot of that going on, and that's that would I'm not going to do that, because that just ruins the whole thing for everybody. I think, yeah, and I haven't really seen anybody who's stuck, really stuck with it, and really kind of wanted to penetrate in, to get to the core of things, which is sort of disappointing, but maybe one of these days it'll happen. I don't know.
One last question about Nishijima Roshi,
Sure.
before we talk about the book, in the time we've got left. You write, because Nishijima Roshi wanted to teach Zen to non-Japanese people, he taught himself English by buying a set of instructional tapes and diligently following every lesson. He even considered moving to the United States, as several other Japanese Zen teachers had done, although ultimately he decided against it. So this is maybe a little wild card question. What do you think would have happened if he'd moved to the States? With his personality and his style, how do you think that would have gone down? And if we're talking about alternate history here.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I've kind of wondered about that, whether he would have been able, because he made a few trips, and this is before I met him. So I wasn't around, not long before I met him, I guess, if I think about the timeline. But he did make a few trips to the US and do a few appearances here and there when he was thinking, and I didn't even realize this until kind of recently, that he was actually considering moving over to the US. And I don't know. I don't, he wasn't into institutions, but he did, he did have this dream of Dogen Sangha International and of teaching it to outside of Japan, because he's not alone in this. There's a lot of Japanese Zen teachers. Suzuki Roshi was one of them. One of the reasons he founded the San Francisco Zen Center is he'd noticed the same thing Nishijima Roshi had noticed, that it was kind of dead in Japan. I mean, there are still, of course, sincere students in Japan, and they crop up every once in a while, but it's become a kind of dead institution. It's become that guild of funeral directors, and he thought that maybe the West was ripe for an awakening of this stuff, and that the students that he found there were more sincere than what you would find in Japan. So he probably would have. I imagine he probably would have been along the same lines as what Kobun Chino Roshi was doing, which was Kobun never became famous, but then again, Kobun's one of Kobun's students was Steve Jobs, of Apple. So now if you Google Kobun Chino Roshi, all this stuff about Steve Jobs comes up. So he definitely had an influence, and probably Nishijima Roshi would have had a similar sort of influence, but probably in a way that would have been less visible than, say, the San Francisco Zen Center or something like that. Whether I'd have joined it or not, I don't know. I sometimes think about that. Would I have been interested in him in that context, rather than, because I kind of went to him initially because mostly because the time that he offered his classes was convenient. I think about that now, and I think how mundane that was. But there was somebody else offering classes that were really early in the morning on weekdays, and he was offering classes at 1 PM on Saturdays. I'm like, well, I'm going to go to that guy, to the 1 PM guy. I'm not going to get up at 4 AM to try to go to this other thing. Yeah, it was all that kind of context, and I think things happen. I have that kind of. I'm one of those people that believes that things happen the way they're supposed to happen, no matter what we do, and so maybe this is just. A lot of things have happened in my life. When I think about them, I go, "That's weird." Running into Tim McCarthy, for example, was really weird. In 1983 in Ohio, there weren't a lot of Zen teachers running around, and I just happened to, literally live right next to one. And I think about that, like, that's odd. So I think things just happen the way they happen, and they kind of have their own trajectory.
your book, The Other Side of Nothing, is about ethics, but
Mhm.
also about metaphysics, you could
Yeah.
say. And that's an interesting link there. And one of the things about ethics that's sometimes said, and one hears people, and you've done this actually, you've made videos about why good teachers go bad and that sort of thing. Um, One of the things that's often said is, one hears a lot said, is that one of the should we say safeguards or feedback mechanisms is to have a teacher, even if
Yeah.
oneself is actually a teacher, even if one is a
Yeah.
teacher oneself. So have you ever tried to do that when you came back to the States and you were out of the orbit of Nishijima Roshi? Did you ever shop around to see if you could find a senior teacher to kind of relate to in that way? Is that something that you ever attempted to do?
Well, I suppose to a certain extent, Tim is still around. Nishijima Roshi passed away a few years ago, but Tim is still around, and he tends to be a hard person to get a hold of. But I do communicate with him and now and then. So I still have him around, and I did. There are a few people who were impressive to me. There's a woman named Zuiko Redding at a place called the Cedar Rapids Zen Center, and she's unknown, but I think she's a really good Zen teacher out there in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. There's a few people here and there who I do relate to, but I kind of feel like, I had my teacher, and my teacher is well, the two teachers I had are who they were, and that's kind of that's probably what's meant to be, and I can't jump ship and find somebody else. It's weird how these things happen. It's kind of like you're there's probably, for all of us, there's a teacher, who's going to be the person, and encountering that person is kind of a matter of luck often. I don't know. I suppose it's karma. It's probably more than just luck, and I don't think it's something you can make happen. But it's something you can learn to be open enough to recognize when it does happen. But I don't think you can kind of make it happen. So yeah, I never really tried to find another teacher. I'm always kind of I'm willing to listen to anybody and see where they're coming from, and I think there's a few people out there who have a deep sort of understanding. But at the same time, one of the things people ask me to do is recommend other teachers, and I don't have like a Rolodex of teachers I want to recommend. And the other thing is, I don't want to I don't want to send somebody to somebody else who's going to go and annoy one of my friends. Sometimes I think of it that way. I think, so yeah, I don't know if that's an answer.
Yeah, very interesting. So let's talk a bit about the book, and it's been such a fascinating conversation, Brad, and we won't have time to do the book justice, but I read The Other Side of Nothing, and very, very, I enjoyed it a lot. Very interesting book indeed.
Thank
and
you.
Of course, and I have links down below. And one of the things I liked about it, which I don't think we're going to have time to talk about actually, is you go through this consideration of ethics, and you deal with different ways in which ethics have been framed in Buddhism, and the Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, that sort of thing, and right view and all that sort of thing. And you give a sort of Dogen spin on a lot of them. And there's a lot of very interesting points you make, counter points, I think, to a lot of the ways that, for example, the Eightfold Noble Path is commonly understood, using that Dogen lens. And as you say, bringing out many of Dogen's contradictions and attempting to penetrate them in his very interesting metaphors and references that he makes, which are quite opaque at first glance, at least to the uninitiated, and you unpack them. And we won't, I don't think, have time really now to go into that in great depth, but that's something I enjoyed. But
thank you.
I did have a question. You write, I didn't mean to write this book. I wanted to write a book about ethics, specifically Buddhist ethics. But in addition to writing about Buddhist ethics, I ended up writing a lot about the Buddhist ideas about the structure of reality, what some folks call non-duality. So,
Yeah.
could you say why a book about ethics had you write about metaphysics?
Yeah, I just found it was impossible to write about Buddhist ethics without getting into those areas, because it's all sort of based on that. And it's Buddhist ethics is based on the idea that we are all intimately connected, interconnected. There's interdependence is a word that people like a lot. Um, we're all intimately connected. That it's an illusion that we are separate individuals, and that we have this autonomous. We have a little bit of autonomy, but we imagine that we have way more than we actually have. That's my tentative conclusion to that question, is that we have a bit of that, but much less than we imagine we have. And so we're all intimately connected, and the reason to act ethically is, in a sense, it's a selfish, I don't like to use the word selfish because it's such a bad, has a bad taste, but it is the best thing that you can do if you want to have a decent life for yourself, is behave ethically. And we live in a society that often doesn't understand that, that thinks, well, you can get ahead of the other guy and push him aside, and kind of end up in a better position by acting unethically, but the Buddhist precepts would seem to be a lot of rules to keep you from doing those things. And you go, well, I might get ahead if I lie, steal, and cheat and kill, all these things that are considered to be against the Buddhist ethics. But they're not put forward as rules. They're what they're saying is, if you actually want to have a good life, if you want to be happier, act ethically, and pay attention to that, because you're connected to everyone. So anything you do to another person, literally you're doing to yourself, because there's nobody else here. You think there's all these other people here, and that we're independent, and that you can gain something at the expense of somebody else, but that's an illusion. You can't. It's impossible to do that. The best you can do is kind of in the short term. You can get a little bit ahead, but the universe will always come along and even it out for you, even if you don't want it to even out. It'll flatten everything, because that's just it all has to kind of settle into the one line that it settles into. And so if you're going to talk in depth, which I tried to do in this book, about ethics and their reason, you have to get into this. And what you get into, what I got into, is some of the really mystical, weird sounding stuff that I actually like a lot. I've always had a soft spot for that, all that weird talk that Buddhists do, but I thought it was important to relate that to just nuts and bolts, real things in the real world, because it's not all going off into space and having an experience of the universe, like the experience I talked about earlier in this podcast. Those kind of experiences can be valuable too, but what's really going on is what's going on right here. And right here, you're just relating to other people and other things, and trying to do the right thing by them. But this is often, it's often very sticky, because like the first precept is do not kill. And the staunchest vegan in the world still has to kill things in order to survive. So you get it into your head. We often get it into our heads that we can beat the game. We can find this perfect thing, and we're going to find all the rules and just be perfect people. But you're not. You're not built that way. You're built in such a way that you can't survive without harming things. But you try to lessen the harm that you do, and do what's right in this moment, in this situation. So part of what Buddhist ethics asks you to do is you keep this big picture in mind, but there are times when you just have to take care of the situation that's right in front of you, and sometimes that requires you to be able to act freely without being constricted by a set of hard rules. So you have the rules, but you actually are trying to maintain a certain amount of freedom from those rules, which gets, it's like the contradiction. It's like, it's not aliens. I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. You end up contradicting the Buddhist ethics even while trying to uphold them. But the reason those precepts are there is because in almost every situation, you're best to follow the precepts. But you also have to be aware that there are going to be situations in which you're going to have to violate the letter of the precepts in order to keep the spirit of the precepts, and that's a really tricky one. And that's one where you can easily go wrong. People will think, well, that means I'm free of all rules, and it's like, no, not quite.
To give people a flavor of some of the Dogen that you bring in, for right view, you quote him as saying, right view as a branch of the path is the inside of the eyes containing the body. And he later says, those who do not put the body into the eyes are not Buddhist ancestors. And in right speech, he says, you quote him as saying, right speech is mastery of the state in which the mouth is hung on the wall. It is mastery of the state in which all mouths are hung on all walls. It is all mouths being hung on all walls.
Yeah, he's a weirdo, isn't he?
What can you say about the Dogen use of these metaphors and other devices that you bring out in the book?
Yeah, Dogen is really interesting. He's because he does he has this side of him where he talks really practically. There are sections of Shobo Genzo in which my favorite is where he tells you how to use the toilet, and he goes into just all the it's all based on what medieval Japanese toilets were like, so you can't really apply it precisely to today, but he goes into this tremendous nitty-gritty detail about how to do this incredibly mundane thing that we all have to do every day. And then he'll go on these flights of like you just quoted, where it's just like, what the hell are you talking about? It's just the eyes inside of the body. And often one of the things I've found since I've become a guy who's known to comment on Dogen, and I've read the original texts, and I've tried to get into the scholarly. I wasn't trained in a university or anything, but I had a Nishijima Roshi was very into that, and he showed me what the metaphors mean, and he explains a lot of this stuff, so I can go there, but I often find that I'm guessing, and I think we all are guessing when you come across a phrase like that. You're kind of like going, oh, how does that feel? And he's trying to present something for which there are no words. So that whole thing about mouths hung on walls, that's actually one of his easier metaphors, because he kind of clues you into what that means, and it just means being silent. So he's basically saying right speech is knowing when to shut up and not talk at all. So that one's fairly easy, although you could dig deeper into it and find a lot of metaphysical things. But he's taking a worldview that's quite different from the standard worldview. So the body being inside the eyes is kind of his. I think I get what he's referring to, but I'm just as hard pressed as he is to find a good way to say that, but if you go through this practice for long enough, you get a feeling for statements like that, where what you thought was, top is actually bottom, and what you thought was inside is actually outside. And so then, in a sense, you think the eyes are inside the body and that they're just this organ, and in one sense that's true, but in another sense, there's a bigger self that is in which the body, the individual self fits into. And one of the things we're asked to do in this tradition is give up our desire to do what the individual wants in order to try to understand what the bigger self wants to happen. And often these things are at odds, and our usual way to deal with it when these things are at odds is to defer to the small self and to go, well, I'm not going to worry about what that wants. I'm going to do what I want. And every time you make the decision to do that, things are just going to go wonky because the bigger self is determines what needs to happen. So you have to kind of give up a lot of what you think of as your own autonomy. I keep using that word, don't I? And just kind of do what's necessary. But seeing how to do what's necessary is difficult. And that's one of the reasons we do this practice of Zazen. You spend a certain amount of time every day being really quiet, not trying to make anything happen, just existing like a rock or a plant or something. You just put yourself down and you're just like, okay, now I'm going to be a tree stump here for the next half hour. And most of the time nothing spectacular happens, but it does end up providing a kind of insight into this bigger something that is actually what's in charge.
Yeah, this has been so fascinating, and I think we'll have to bring it to an end now out of respect for your time. But one thing that I found very interesting, perhaps we'll finish with this, is you don't touch on a lot of what you might call our hot button ethical issues. Perhaps that's by design. Yeah. I can see you nodding. And I'm wondering about that. But also, there is something you mentioned, which I was curious if you might expand on it. You write, of course, this is about your time in Kenya. One other thing that was very different between Wadsworth, Ohio, and Nairobi, Kenya, was that Wadsworth was made up of mostly white people, and Nairobi mostly black people. Yeah. Not many white Americans had the experience of standing out in a crowd simply because they're white, but I did, both when my family lived in Kenya and later when I lived in Japan. I think it changed the way I look at lots of racial issues. Yeah. So I'm curious about that. What was that change?
It's hard to tell because I don't know. I can't rewind and do it another way and see what it would have been like otherwise. But I kind of, I don't know. It's all different. It's weird. It's weird being on the other side of things, because you can see aspects of it that there's even that sort of person who's they say woke, the woke white person who's trying to do what they think a minority person wants the majority to do. And having been on the other side of that, I can go, it's probably, your guesses are probably wrong about what those people want you to do or how they want you to be. Mostly, I found that I just wanted people to behave normally around me. The African people that I knew in Africa, the Japanese people I knew in Japan, I didn't want them to bend over and try to treat me in some special way. I just wanted to be included, in their stuff. And I had close friends in both places who would do that, who would just forget, you'd forget about that stuff and just kind of be just be friends and not worry about all that stuff. So when I see people who are very well-meaning, kind of bending over backwards and trying to do the right thing. I often think, oh yeah, you guys are probably, you're probably not making any points by doing that. And it gets a little crazy sometimes. So, but then again, then if you point that out, you're seen as being, wow, you're just you don't understand. But I'm kind of like, well, I don't say I understand what it's like, for example, to be a Black person in the United States, but I do know what it's like to be a white person in Africa, and I do know what it's like to be a white person in Japan, and being kind of on the outside, and everybody immediately knows you're on the outside. If you encounter somebody of your own, ethnicity, it might take you a little while to realize that person might be an outsider, but immediately, like, here I am right in your face here. I've had this experience in Japan of forgetting that I wasn't Japanese. After a few years, I could speak the language and everything, and I was pretty steeped in the culture, and I would often just forget that I wasn't Japanese, and then something would happen, that would remind me, some reaction I got from somebody, and go, oh yeah, I'm not, they can see that I'm not. Actually, one of the first time, it was kind of a weird experience. I'm sorry to go on this, but it's funny. The first time I went to England, I'd been living in Japan for years, and I went to England, and walking around in, I don't know, London or somewhere, I suddenly realized that nobody here knows I'm a foreigner until I open my mouth, which was not the, in Japan, they knew it immediately. They could just look at me and they'd know I was a foreigner. Over there, I would have to say something. And as soon as I say something, then they know I'm a foreigner. But otherwise I can be incognito, which I couldn't do that in Japan. And so it's just those kind of experiences, you have enough of them and they pile on. But it's hard to say anything really definite, which is why I sort of try to stay away from those issues, because it tends to be something people like to argue about. And I'm like, well, I don't really want to argue about this. Because I just think it's interesting, and I don't want to argue about it. But if somebody sincerely wants to talk about it, I can go for hours talking about it, because I find the whole dynamic of it really interesting.
Fascinating. Well, Brad, thank you very much. This has been such an interesting conversation. Brad Warner, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.